1 year ago, almost 2/3 of Australians had decided to vote yes on the voice referendum, and many thought that it would pass quite easily. It sounded like a very simple and popular proposition involving a group of Indigenous representatives called the Voice that the government could consult with when it's forming Aboriginal laws and policy. As of today, only 1/3 of Aussies are firmly committed to a yes vote, with around another quarter undecided. It's been quite a remarkable turnaround. Think about that for a second. In September 2022, almost 2 out of every 3 Australians said they would vote yes on the voice referendum. Today, that number has halved to just 1/3. That's an incredible turnaround. So did what we're being asked to vote on change? Or did we, as Australians, change our minds? And if so, why? Well, what may surprise you is that how this is unfolding is not unusual when it comes to referendums. In the end, no is the way almost all referendums go. Over the last 122 years, we've had 44 referendums, and only 8 of those 44 have resulted in a yes vote. Historically, there have been 4.5 no wins for every 1 yes win, a win ratio for no of 82%. That's a higher win ratio than the best performing football teams in both the Aussie Rules and the Rugby League this year. To try to find a relevant point of comparison, consider the tennis player Roger Federer, the player that many regard to be the greatest in history. Roger chalked up 1,251 wins and 275 losses in his career. Now that's a win ratio of 82%, the same win ratio that the no win has in Australian referendums. So you could say that no is to an Aussie referendum what Roger Federer was to tennis. That's an incredible ratio. So why are us Aussies so biased to voting no? Well, there are 4 big contributing factors, and the first of those is trust. Let's be honest, us Aussies don't tend to trust our politicians, and we tend to think that when something seems too good to be true, it probably is. When you think about our history, this mindset is, at least in part, somewhat justified. From being sent across the world as convicts to being pushed into the fray at Gallipoli, we've had good reason at times to distrust those in charge. And this is where the simplicity of the referendum question is its own downfall. The simpler the proposal is, the more we become convinced that there must be more to it, that they must be trying to trick us. So why are the questions put to us so simple and so broad? And why isn't there more detail on how the proposals will actually work? Well, referendums are questions in really broad terms because they're about amending a framework, not creating detailed laws or policies. The Constitution is the framework we adopted in 1901 that outlines the broad rules for running Australia. Essentially, it's the legal principles we use to run the country. It's not meant to be as prescriptive as a policy or a parliamentary law, otherwise it wouldn't survive the test of time. Take the voice, for example, where the aim of the referendum is to amend the Constitution to say the following: in recognition of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as the first peoples of Australia, there shall be a body to be called the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice. The Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice may make representations to the Parliament and the Executive Government of the Commonwealth on matters relating to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws with respect to the matters concerning to the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Voice, including its composition, functions, powers and procedures. It's pretty devoid of detail, isn't it? And therein lies the problem. Without the detail, we're prone not to trust it. In the absence of detail, we start to speculate on what those details might be. We start to think there's a hidden agenda. The little voice in our head says surely it just can't be that simple. And this is one of the big misunderstandings about the role of the Constitution. Changing the Constitution is hard, really hard, as we have to have a nationwide vote and we, the people, almost always say no. So what's in the Constitution needs to be designed to last for a very long time, as it can't be easily changed from year to year like normal laws can. Think about our tax laws, for example. The Constitution's language on taxation is very simple. It says, "The Parliament shall, subject to this Constitution, have power to make laws for the peace, order, and good government of the Commonwealth with respect to taxation." That's incredibly vague and lacking in detail. How we've been taxed has changed numerous times since that document was written. In the beginning, only the states collected income tax. Now the federal government does. That's a huge change. And beyond that, the tax rate for individuals and companies have changed numerous times. We've also introduced GST, superannuation, capital gains, deductions, etc., etc. And that's a good example of the difference between the role of the constitutional law and the role of parliamentary law. The Constitution provides the broad framework, and it very, very rarely changes. And the government uses this framework to create laws and policies. What the Voice Amendment is asking from us is to trust Parliament, not just today's Labor government, but all the future governments, Labor and Liberal, and whatever other political parties might run the country over the years to come. And they're trusting them to use this voice framework to figure out over time the very best way to apply it. And that's the way all other laws work in Australia too. One government comes in and implements new laws using the Constitution as its guiding framework. And with each government, the laws change, usually for the better, as we build a better and better country over time. What we need to keep in mind is that the way Anthony Albanese implements the voice will probably be different than the next Prime Minister. The voice will continue, but how it works will change and improve over and over for generations. That's how our system is meant to work, with the Constitution providing the lasting framework and each government changing the detail of how that framework is applied. Imagine if the Constitution did prescribe the details of how all these things needed to work. There'd likely be references to senators needing to communicate with one another by telegram, or to arrive at Parliament by horse and cart. It just wouldn't survive the test of time, and as a nation, we'd become constipated. And this is why referendum questions can't be overly specific. They need to allow for change. But without the detail, it's only natural that people will speculate. How many times have you heard people say, "The voice is an unknown risk," or "This is the start of the government taking our houses away," or "This is like signing a blank cheque"? Having a voice doesn't make it any more or any less likely for the government to repossess our homes, or for us to spend more or less money on Indigenous people. The voice isn't about how much we spend, and it has nothing to do with land rights. It's about having representatives of the Indigenous community that the government can consult before it passes laws on Indigenous affairs. Some future governments will spend less than we do now on Indigenous people, some will spend more. But this has nothing to do with what you're voting on with the voice. And if you think about it logically, the Indigenous population is less than 4% of the total. Any government that makes policy that significantly disadvantages the 96% to favour the 4% will not be in power very long. So one-sided policy like taking away people's homes is extremely unlikely to happen. If by some chance it did, the government that did so would likely lose the next election, and as soon as the next government comes in, it would almost certainly reverse the parts of the policy that didn't make sense. That's how our democracy works, as we learn and improve the country over time, and how the majority make sure that policies work for the whole country. All the checks and balances are in place for the voice that are there for any other initiative. But when you ask an untrusting population to vote on a broad, undefined framework in a referendum, no almost always wins. By contrast, when the Senate votes on laws, about 70% of the time, they vote yes. 82% no when we vote on a proposed law, and 70% yes when the Senate votes on a proposed law. That shows you just how distrustful we are. When you think about it, it's lucky we're not involved in all of the laws, or almost nothing would get done. Our distrust of government would grind the country to a halt. So the first big reason we vote no is a lack of trust. The second big reason why our referendums are usually a no vote is ego, or us thinking we have a better idea. We so rarely get given the opportunity to vote on policy like the government gets to do, that when we do, it's only natural that we want to take even more control and suggest our own ideas. After all, they're asking us to do their jobs. We may as well do it properly, right? Take the voice vote, for example. How many times have you heard someone say, "You know what I think we need? Instead of a voice, we should have a treaty." Or, "I don't think we should work on the voice, I think we should work on listening." I hear these kinds of statements all the time, and it's a natural human response. But just think about what we're really saying when we make comments like that. The voice came about through almost a decade of experts investigating a host of alternatives and through extensive consultation with the Indigenous people. Over 80% of Indigenous people support the voice, as do those experts that invested years of their life into coming up with the best proposal. After all that, having watched a few YouTube videos and spent all of a few weeks thinking about it, so many of us are sure we have a better idea. A better idea than the Indigenous people and all the experts involved in investigating it. That it should be a treaty or a survival of the fittest test, or we just get better at listening. And this notion of us wanting to think that we know better is another factor that leads us to vote no on referendums. So trust and ego are two big reasons why 82% of referendums end in a no. The third factor is political loyalty. In the 44 referendums we've had to date, not a single referendum has passed that hasn't had bipartisan support. By that, I mean that both the Prime Minister and the opposition leader both publicly support the referendum. Now, some of you are probably thinking, what? There have been times when both sides of politics have actually agreed on a policy. Well, yes, believe it or not, that used to happen. The role of the opposition is not meant to be to disagree with everything the government proposes. It is meant to support the things that make sense and to oppose or change the things that don't. But over the last 20 years, it increasingly doesn't seem to work this way. Regardless of the issue at hand, it feels like whoever's in government, that the opposition will vehemently oppose whatever policy is put forward. Take the Voice, for example. The Voice was formally endorsed by Indigenous leaders in 2017. In October 2019, the Liberal National Morrison government communicated its support to an Indigenous voice to advise on government policy. The Morrison government's discussions centred around the voice being passed through a parliamentary law as opposed to a constitutional law. But that distinction aside, the Liberal Party was in support of the idea of a voice. Labor was also in support and offered to work with the coalition on supporting its implementation. And it looked like, for the first time in a long time, both sides of politics were going to agree on something. And with that bipartisan support, when surveyed in September 2022, 64% of us said we'd vote yes. But then, on the 4th of September 2022, Liberal leader Peter Dutton publicly spoke out against the Voice for the first time and said he'd be voting no. Dutton went on to say he supports recognition of Indigenous Australians in the Constitution, but not the way the referendum was proposed, so that if he was elected, he would propose a second referendum, doing it a better way. And at that moment, everything changed, and we the voters felt like we needed to take sides. For those of us who are Liberal or National voters, instead of voting with our conscience, all of a sudden we felt like we'd be being disloyal if we voted no. Referendums are not elections and have nothing to do with electing political parties. You can vote no in the referendum and still keep voting Labor your entire life. Conversely, you can vote yes for the Voice and still remain loyal to the Liberals or Nationals, voting for them in the next election and every election thereafter. There are numerous Liberal politicians publicly committing to vote yes. When Dutton declared his no position, the former Liberal Indigenous Affairs Minister Ken Wyatt resigned from Parliament in protest. Think about what that means. The Liberal Party's resident expert on Indigenous affairs is in support of the Voice and to this day continues to urge other Liberals to vote yes too. Liberal MPs Julian Lesser and Bridget Archer have also publicly declared they'll be voting yes, and there are several other federal MPs who've spoken out against elements of Dutton's position in internal Liberal Party meetings. Even the New South Wales Liberal opposition leader, Mark Speakman, has publicly committed to voting yes. And former Liberal Chief Minister of the ACT, Kate Carnell, is not only telling Australians to vote yes, but that she believes that yes is in line with Liberal values. But recently, it doesn't feel that way, and as Aussies, we don't like being disloyal. So trust, ego, and political loyalty are three big reasons why most referendums end in no. And the fourth and final factor is the modern media. It is getting harder and harder for a referendum, especially one that aims to address social issues, to get a yes vote the way modern media works. Since the last time we had a yes vote back in 1977, two big things have happened in Australian media. Firstly, we've seen the rise of media with no control, or social media. And secondly, the rise of media with consolidated control, or what a lot of people call the Murdoch media. And while these two may seem very different, they do share a few key things in common. First, let's look at social media. It's almost completely unregulated. Anybody can write or record pretty much anything they want without consequence. And with the power and efficiency of the platforms that support it, it can reach tens of thousands, even millions of people really quickly. One viral video can present a host of unsubstantiated falsehoods to a large number of people in a very short period of time. With The Voice, for example, there is one video on YouTube with over 80,000 views right now that says that the Voice referendum is unfair because asking people to vote yes or no is biased to people voting yes. It really says that. 82% of the time, the no vote wins. Yet this video has a significant amount of Australians believing referendums are unfair because we're biased to vote yes, and we should therefore vote no in protest of how unfair the system is. It's a factually incorrect video made by someone that will likely face no consequences for the incorrectness of their message. But this kind of media has so much influence. And then you have the consolidated media, what many call the Murdoch media. The Murdoch media has a television audience in the millions through their ownership of Foxtel and Sky News. But in print, its reach is much greater again. It owns major publications in every state, including the Daily and Sunday Telegraphs, the Herald and Sunday Herald Sun, the Courier Mail, the Sunday Mail, the Brisbane News, the Advertiser, the Mercury, the Sunday Tasmanian, and the Northern Territory News. And while they don't own radio, so many radio talk show hosts base a lot of their daily discussions on content from those newspapers. The reach of the Murdoch press in Australia is enormous, and it has a very successful business model which usually centres around a target consumer of wealthy white men and a message of conservatism. Conservatism meaning commitment to traditional values and opposition to change or innovation. And you've probably noticed that Murdoch media tend to report the news in a way that defend the interests of wealthy white men. A great recent example was in the USA, where the Murdoch media was instrumental in getting Donald Trump elected. And there's one thing that Murdoch media and social media have in common. They've realised, both through algorithms and through research, that we consume way more media when we're in a state of anxiety or fear than when we're not. If they can create a sense of anxiety through sensationalising stories, they're way more successful. So most of our media, social and otherwise, is trying to make us anxious most of the time. Look at the media you see on The Voice, for example. They're going to take our homes. This is going to end up costing us a fortune. Who knows where this will lead? All messages of anxiety and fear, when really the thing we're voting on is not about those things at all. And it's actually pretty uncontentious and simple. It's just whether there should be a body the government may consult with when it's making laws and policies about Indigenous people. That's kind of boring compared to one about the government's secret plan to repossess our homes. So media has become sensationalised and fear-based, both in social and in print. And what do you think happens when Australia's most powerful media organisation that believes in conservatism and uses anxiety-inducing stories to sell media is presented with a proposal like The Voice? Well, a year ago, 64% of Australians supported yes and 36% of Australians were either no or undecided. So if Murdoch was mirroring the Australian mindset at the time, you'd expect that about 36% of the Murdoch news stories would focus on no. However, why we should vote no has actually made up 54% of Murdoch's voice coverage. That's completely disproportionate to what Australians were thinking. But it's not just the ratio of reporting being biased to no, but rather how strong those no messages have been and the fear creation and misinformation they've included. Murdoch has rebranded many of its news reporting from news to news and opinions to give it permission to present what can be false information without liability, even though it still sounds and looks a lot like news. Take the story, for example, from Peter Credlin from Sky News, where she sits behind a news desk and where everything from her outfit to the screen's format looks just like a news broadcast. On this show, and repeated numerous times in Murdoch newspapers thereafter, she states that voting for The Voice is actually voting for a lot more than what's contained in the referendum, and it is actually about voting for both the one-page Uluru Statement from the Heart and also another 26-page document of meeting minutes and interview notes with Indigenous people. This is one of dozens and dozens of articles from Murdoch-owned outlets that have spread fear and misinformation about what The Voice vote is about, and for the most part, there is no consequence of this information, even though many of us think it's actually news. To be clear, the one-page Uluru Statement from the Heart is not what we're voting on in the referendum, nor are we voting on the interview notes. Just to repeat that, despite what you may have heard, the Uluru Statement from the Heart is not what we're voting on. Only The Voice, a body that may be consulted by the government before it makes policy about Indigenous Australians. At the end of the day, if the referendum is successful, anything beyond having a body that the government may consult on Indigenous policy needs to be decided upon by Parliament, like any other policy or law. The media's attempts to claim that voting for The Voice is going to result in an unchecked and irreversible policy of land rights and apologies and increased spend is false. But these false claims have been extremely convincing and far-reaching. So, lack of trust, ego, political loyalty, and the modern media have taken us to this new position. A year ago, there was a proposal almost 2/3 of us agreed with. Then, over the course of a year, we're confronted by our own natural mistrust of its simplicity, by our tendency to think we know better, by an allegiance to our political parties, and by a media with an agenda selling fear. And all of this takes a very simple, quite uncontentious amendment about a body that may advise the government on Indigenous policy and turns it into something much, much bigger and scarier, creating feelings of suspicion, paranoia, anxiety, and even fear. So before you vote, ask yourself if any of these factors impacted you. Have you found yourself thinking there must be more to it, that you're being tricked? That because there's not enough detail, then the safe bet is to vote no? Have you indulged in thinking you've got a better way to solve it than the experts? Are you worried you might be betraying your political party if you vote no? Have you found yourself feeling unnecessarily anxious or scared about what this might lead to? If so, you may be falling into the same trap most of us do leading into a referendum. Because when you break it all down, what you're being asked to vote on is really very simple. You're being asked to vote on whether there should be a body representing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples that the government may consult on policy. Anything beyond that will be decided upon by Parliament like any other law or policy. And the many governments to come shall continue to improve how The Voice works over time as they learn. If that makes sense to you, vote yes. If it doesn't, vote no. But don't fall into the referendum trap of thinking there's more to it or feeling afraid. There's really nothing to be afraid about. Thanks for listening and good luck.